evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? On a Sunday afternoon. Excuse me. Yehuda in South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Carla in Brazil, Paul in the Great Northwest Shandor in the Bronx, Bella in Florida, Melissa in Great Neck Guy in Ohio, Lucy in Minnesota, Sharon in New Jersey, Bill in Texas, Joe in the Inland Empire, Marjorie in Georgia, Ella's in the house. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is page 85 here in Tractate Bava, Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 here in chapter 8 of Tractate Bava, Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. We've been talking about an eye for an eye does not mean that the court steps in and takes the eye of the one who causes an injury such that the injured party loses an eye. Rather, we assess a monetary value and the party who is liable pays that. And now that we're talking about paying damages, we see that there's 5 categories of damages that are going to be relevant. The actual damage, what was lost, in addition to loss of livelihood while the person is recovering, medical costs, pain and suffering, humiliation. I feel like I'm missing one. Damage, medical, pain and suffering, loss of livelihood, and humiliation. Maybe I said something twice. At any rate, today we're talking about how are medical costs assessed. How are medical costs assessed? And this is going to be a really interesting conversation because, as you can imagine, the practice of medicine was not quite as, evolved, let's say, according to the standards of modern science 2,000 years ago as it is today. So what does that mean as you go and assess the costs of medical care? So the Mishna teaches, how is payment for medical costs assessed? Meaning the one who caused the injury is liable for medical costs because it's an injury that he caused directly. So how do we assess that amount of money? So if one struck another, then he is liable to heal him by paying for his medical costs. Pretty simple. And the sages taught in a Baraisa, Tosefta 9:4, if growths appeared on the injured area due to the injury, and the wound reopened, then the one who caused the injury is again liable to heal him by covering his medical costs, and is liable to give him the value of his loss of livelihood while he recovers from the reopened wound. But if the growths that appeared are not due to the injury, he is not liable to heal him by covering his medical costs, and he is not liable to give him the value of the loss of his livelihood. Makes sense, right? If the ongoing medical issue that the one who is injured is having is caused by the injury that he suffered as a result of the actions of the defendant, then the defendant is on the hook for that. But if he can make a credible argument, the defendant can credibly argue that the injured party recovered from the wound that was caused by the injury, and whatever these other problems are that he's having later, she's having later, are not a direct consequence of that injury. So why should he be liable, right? He should not be liable for that, nor for the time that the person spends recovering and cannot be working. Now, the Baraisa continues. Rabbi Yehuda says that even if the growths appeared due to the injury, he is liable to heal him by covering the medical costs, but he's not liable to give him the value of his loss of livelihood. And the rabbis say the one who caused the injury is not liable at all, because the Torah states the laws of compensation for his loss of livelihood and his medical costs together. And this teaches that anyone who is liable to pay compensation for loss of livelihood is also liable to pay compensation for medical costs. And anyone who is not liable to pay compensation for loss of livelihood is also not liable to pay compensation for medical costs. In other words, how far does the chain of causation from the injury extend? So the Gemara asks, with regard to what do they disagree? Rabba said, I found the sages in the study hall of Rav when they were sitting and were stating an explanation. So here, Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis disagree about whether a wound may be wrapped in a bandage, i.e., whether one is permitted to bandage his wound to lessen the pain at the risk of causing damaging side effects. And here we run into the limitations of medicine as it was practiced 2,000 years ago, when maybe they had some sense of natural disinfectants, natural antibacterial healing agents. They had some sense of that, but they didn't really have advanced germ theory. They didn't really have antiseptic creams and ointments, etc. So not all medical providers are created equal. You could say that even today. But especially back then, is it good to put a bandage on a wound? Depends on the kind of wound, and it depends on the kind of bandage. So if it was a proper dressing for the wound, good. It's going to help it heal and it will speed up the healing. But if the one who was dressing the wound didn't really understand what is going to be an appropriate and effective bandage, then the injured party could really have a problem, not only from the wound, but from the inappropriate treatment, which might, for example, result in a bandage that is too heavy, that has the wrong materials included in it, and that traps in bacteria and other harmful elements that are going to not speed the healing, but hinder it, and possibly introduce infection, gangrene, etc., that if he had had a better healer, wouldn't have happened. So what they're going to discuss here is, okay, if the person sought medical care and the medical care ended up doing more harm than the injury, then is the one who caused the injury on the hook for the full extent of the consequences of the injury, even though they were really indirectly caused by the injury. The medical care that intervened actually caused greater harm than the injury itself. We would think, logically speaking, maybe the one who started the chain of events is guilty because he started it, is liable because he started it, or is not liable because he certainly didn't cause that kind of damage. It was this inappropriate care. So Rab explains the rabbis, i.e. the first Tan in the Baraisa, hold that a wound may be wrapped in a bandage. And consequently, if the bandage causes side effects which lead the injured party to incur additional medical expenses, those expenses are considered to have resulted from the original injury. This was, appropriate medical care, and then, things got worse. Okay, but you couldn't have expected to do any better. That was just part of the process, and the medical care just didn't exist. That could have stopped it. So therefore, with regard to medical costs, about which the verse repeated the obligation to pay them by stating, and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed, verapo yerape, thoroughly healed, right? To cause him to be healed is the way the Hebrew always repeats a verb with a slightly different syntax for emphasis. So according to that verse, the one who caused the injury is liable to pay compensation. But for loss of livelihood, about which the verse did not repeat the obligation to pay it, the one who caused the injury is not liable to pay compensation. Again, we're not talking about loss of livelihood in the future as a result of the injury. Like, for example, somebody was a pianist and lost his hand. That's going to be assessed in the damage. When we're talking about loss of livelihood, we're simply talking about the amount of time that the person can't do anything at all because he's busy healing. And that's going to be a different measure than future loss of earnings because he can no longer, perform his profession. Rabbah continues, and I said to them that if Rabbi Yehuda were to hold that a wound may not be wrapped in a bandage, then the one who caused the injury should also not be liable to pay compensation for medical costs, as he is not liable to compensate the injured party for damage resulting from his own irresponsible behavior. Rather, the disagreement is as follows. Everyone agrees that a wound may be wrapped in a bandage, but may not be wrapped in an excessive bandage. In other words, an inappropriate bandage, a poorly made bandage, a bandage that represents harmful medical care. So he explains the dispute. So Rabbi Yehuda holds that since a wound may not be wrapped in an excessive bandage, then with regard to medical costs, about which the verse repeated the obligation to pay them by stating, Varapo Yerape, the one who caused the injury is liable to pay compensation. But for loss of livelihood, about which the verse did not repeat the obligation to pay, the one who caused the injury is not liable to pay compensation. And the rabbis, i.e. the first Tana and the Baraisa, hold, since the verse repeated the obligation to pay compensation for medical costs, one is also liable to pay compensation for loss of livelihood, which is juxtaposed to the obligation to pay for medical costs, as the verse states, only he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. They go together. Loss of time, right? Loss of livelihood while he's healing, and medical costs. So the Gemara comments, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that even though the medical costs and loss of livelihood are juxtaposed, the one who caused the injury is not liable to pay compensation for loss of livelihood in this case because the merciful one restricted it in the Torah. As the verse states, only he shall pay for his loss of livelihood and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. And this word only he shall pay, is a restricting term. And the rabbis who hold that one must pay for loss of livelihood in this case as well, hold that the word only is coming to exclude growths that were not due to the injury, with regard to which the one who caused the injury is exempt from liability. But for this unfortunate infection that set in, we could argue it was the doctor's fault, but it wouldn't have happened if there wasn't an original injury to begin with. So the rabbis say the guy pays. So the Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of the latter rabbis in the Baraisa, who say that anyone who is liable to pay compensation for loss of livelihood is liable to pay compensation for medical costs, and anyone who is not liable to pay compensation for loss of livelihood is not liable to pay compensation for medical costs. So why do I need, i.e., how do I account for the fact that the verse repeated the obligation to pay medical costs? And the Gemara answers, it is necessary for that which the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught. As it is taught in the Baraisa that the school of Rabbi Yishmael says, when the verse states, and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed, verapo yerape, it is derived from here that permission is granted to a doctor to heal. And it is not considered to be an intervention counter to the will of God. Somebody might have argued that when a person gets hurt, the healer, and we say this in our prayers every day, that God is the healer, right? God will heal the wounds. And the human body has a tremendous capacity to heal itself. So you might have thought that if somebody gets hurt, okay, make him comfortable, and then God will decide whether this person is going to heal or not. And we wouldn't, send a doctor in to exercise his craft and add to the healing because, God will decide whether the person is healed or not, and the doctor shouldn't interfere with that. You might have thought that. You would be wrong. And so the sages say, no, if a doctor is available, then God intervened by making the doctor available. And if the doctor brings healing powers that are, able to heal the wound, okay, so God arranged for the doctor to be there and heal the patient. In other words, we do not say that a doctor needs to stay out of the healing process. Rather, the doctor is given permission to heal. The doctor is given permission to step in and heal the patient. Now, is it an obligation for the doctor to heal if he has that opportunity? Let's keep reading. The sages taught in a Baraisa, from where is it derived? That if growths appeared due to the injury, all right, so the process of healing from the injury, brought complications later, and the wound reopened, then the one who caused the injury is again liable to heal him by covering his medical costs and is liable to give him the value of his loss of livelihood while he recovers from the reopened wound. And the verse states, and he shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. And one might have thought that this is the law even if the growths were not due to the injury. Therefore, the verse states, only he shall pay for the loss of his livelihood in order to exclude this case. And this is in accordance with the opinion of the first Tan of the previous Baraisa. Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda says, even if the growths appear due to the injury, the one who caused the injury is exempt, as it is stated only. Again, they're starting to argue about, well, the stuff that happens later, was it really caused by the injury, or was it caused by medical intervention, or simply by time? Are we going to say that the one who caused the injury is going to be liable for any medical problems that the victim has at that site on his body for the rest of his life? There has to be a cutoff somewhere. Where's it going to be? So there are those who say that Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda says, even if the growths appear due to the injury, the one who caused the injury is completely exempt from paying compensation, both for medical costs and loss of livelihood. And this is in accordance with the opinion of the latter rabbis in the previous Baraisa. And there are those who say that Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda says, even if the growths appear due to the injury, the one who caused the injury is exempt from paying compensation for loss of livelihood, but is liable to pay compensation for medical costs. In accordance with whose opinion is this statement? It is in accordance with the opinion of his father, Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara analyzes the statement of the Baraisa. The master said, one might have thought that this is the law, the halacha, even if the growths were not due to the injury. Therefore, the verse states, only he shall pay for his loss of livelihood, to teach that he's exempt in this case. So the Gemara asks, is there a need for the verse to teach that he's exempt in the case of growths that were not due to the injury? Why would anybody think that he'd be liable for that? And the sages say, what did the Baraisa mean when it said that the growths were not due to the injury? As it is taught in a Baraisa, in the case of one who violated his doctor's instructions. Right? So the doctor came and gave proper advice, proper direction for his medical care, but the patient wouldn't listen to the doctor, and the wound got worse. Now, do we really want the one who caused the injury to be liable for that when the victim, as it were, the plaintiff in the litigation, wouldn't follow the doctor's advice, and that's why it got worse? I mean, at what point do we cut off the liability? As it is taught in a Baraisa, in the case of one who violated his doctor's instructions and he ate honey or any type of sweet food, which the doctor had instructed him not to eat because of the fact that honey or any type of sweet foods are detrimental to the recovery from the injury. And his injury developed garguteni. Sounds a little bit like gangrene, doesn't it? One might have thought that the one who caused the injury should be liable to heal him by covering his medical costs. And therefore the verse states, only. And this is to teach that the one who caused the injury is exempt in this case because the victim of the injury didn't follow the doctor's instructions for recovery. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of garguteni? And Abaye said necrosis. And what is its remedy? Crystalline ice plant and wax and wine dregs. Now, about this idea that the one who didn't follow the doctor's instructions, what was the nature of his failing to follow doctor's orders? That he ate a bunch of sweet foods. Now, we have a family friend who is a nutritionist and is always on a very, very emphatic mission to tell people to stay off sugar. Well, says Rav Steinsaltz in a commentary here, ingesting, and I'm sure Rav Steinsaltz, because I know he did, would consult with modern doctors and scientists, creating the commentary here for the Koran Talmud with his elucidation. So the note says, ingesting large quantities of sweet foods can cause a rise in blood sugar, which in turn can delay the healing of injuries. In addition, poor circulation caused by the fatty deposits in the arteries can limit the amount of oxygen and healing nutrients that reach a wound. Nerve damage or neuropathy causes numbness in the feet that prevents open wounds from healing, and moreover, when blood sugar levels are high, the immune system cannot effectively do its job of clearing away dead and damaged tissue and building new skin cells. Okay. The Gemara presents several laws, several halachas, concerning compensation for medical costs. And if one who caused the injury says to the injured party, I will heal you myself, as I am a doctor. So the injured party can say to him, well, you are to me as a predatory lion. You injured me. Why should I believe you're going to heal me? Because I fear you, and I do not trust you to heal me. And if the one who caused the injury says to the injured party, I will bring a doctor who heals for no cost, so that I will not need to pay for your medical costs. Well, the injured party can say to him, a doctor who heals for no cost is worth nothing. And if the one who caused the injury says to the injured party, I will bring you a doctor from a distant place, the injured party can say to him, a doctor from a distant place blinds the eye. Meaning, a local doctor has an incentive to ensure that the patient fully heals, because he has local reputation to uphold, while a doctor from a distant place has no incentive to monitor the patient once he has received his fee and he can go on his way. And if that one, the injured party, says to the one who caused him injury, give the money to me and I will take responsibility for the healing myself. Well then the one who caused him the injury may say to him, you will be negligent with yourself and you will take more from me than was originally necessary because your healing won't go right. And then you'll come back and ask for more money. And if the injured party says to the one who caused him injury, settle a fixed sum for me to cover my medical costs and I will take care of my own recovery, the one who caused him the injury may say to him, all the more so. With this proposal, is there a concern that you will be negligent with yourself, as you will wish to profit and you will not spend the money on your recovery? And then people will call me an ox that causes damage because I caused an injury from which you did not recover. Right? So it's like the same kind of wisdom that when you have a car accident and people say, let's just settle it here. Yeah, no, it's better. Just do it right. Call the cops, call the insurance company, do the whole thing properly. If there's any kind of injury involved, consult a doctor, start the process of the healing. It's a pain for everybody. It's going to be expensive, but you bring the professionals in to do it. And overall, across all cases, you're going to have better outcomes that way. Sounds like wisdom. With regard to compensation for pain, medical costs, loss of livelihood, and humiliation, right? Those are the 4 types of indemnity beyond the damage itself, the loss of the limb, for example. So the other damages are, right, pain, medical costs, loss of livelihood, and humiliation. So about these, the sages taught in a baraisa, and all of these types of indemnity are paid in a case where the one who caused injury must also pay compensation for damage. And the Gemara asks from where are these matters derived? And Rav Zevid said in the name of Rava, the verse states, a wound for a wound, Exodus 21:25, to teach that the one who caused injury is liable to give compensation for pain in a case of damage. So if your actions, your direct actions of your body or something that you were holding, you caused this damage to a person, as opposed to your animal got out and damaged a person, as we've seen, that's a different case, then you're only liable for the direct damage and not the pain and loss of livelihood and suffering and humiliation, etc. But in a case where you are directly liable for the damage because you caused it yourself, you're also liable for these other 4 indemnities. So the Gemara asks, but isn't this verse necessary to teach an additional halacha? Now we're on 85b. This serves to include the category of those liable to pay compensation. This serves to include in the category of those liable to pay compensation, one who causes injury unwittingly, just as one who causes injury intentionally is liable, and one who causes injury due to circumstances beyond his control, just as one who causes injury willingly. Right? So if you caused it, even though you didn't do it on purpose, you're on the hook as long as it is directly attributable to you. So the Gemara answers, well, if so, and the verse teaches only this, let the verse write the more succinct phrase, a wound, petza, for a wound, befatsta. What is taught by the expanded phrase, petza tachas petza, right? because you could say petza befatza, just using that b prefix. Instead, there is a whole separate word, right? Tachas, right, or tachat. So petza tachat petza. And so that kind of expanded phrase, which didn't have to be used but was used, the sages can rely on it to teach two different laws, both that you're reliable, whether you did it on purpose or not, and that if you're liable for the damage, you're also liable for these additional forms of indemnity. So with regard to compensation for medical costs in a case where one pays compensation for damage, Rav Papa said in the name of Rava that the verse states, he shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. Verapo yerape. And the double term teaches that the one who caused the injury is liable to give monetary compensation for medical costs in a case of compensation for damage. And the Gemara challenges, this verse is necessary for teaching a different law, that which the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught. As the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught, when the verse states, Verapo yerape, from here it is derived that permission is given, permission is granted to a doctor to heal, right? Heal, indeed heal it, right? Meaning let God heal it and add whatever we humans can do. In other words, unleash the powers of the doctor to help heal it, right? That's where we derive that the doctor has permission to insert himself in the healing process. So if so, the Gemara answers, well, if so, let the verse write, Verofe yerape, meaning, and a doctor shall heal. Learn from the phrase employed, right, Verapo yerape, that the one who caused the injury is liable to give monetary compensation for medical costs in a case of damage, as well as learning the law that the doctor is permitted to heal. So the Gemara challenges, but it is still necessary for the halachas that we stated previously. I.e., it was necessary for the verse to repeat the language of healing, as the Gemara explained. And the Gemara answers, if so, let the verse say one of the two words twice. Rather, rapo, rapo, or yerape, yerape. What is taught by repeating the language with a change? Verapo, yerape. Learn from this wording that the one who caused the injury is liable to give monetary compensation for medical costs in case of damage, as well as the other interpretations we've already heard. So the Baraisa stated that compensation for pain, medical costs, loss of livelihood, and humiliation are paid even where the one who caused the injury pays compensation for damage. And the Gemara notes, by inference, it must be that you find these examples of cases where the one who caused an injury must pay compensation for these indemnities that are not in a case of damage. And the Gemara asks, how would you find examples of these cases that are not in a case of damage? Where would you be paying pain and suffering, loss of livelihood, medical costs, and humiliation if there wasn't also damage? And the Baraisa stated that compensation for pain, medical costs, loss of livelihood, and humiliation are paid even where the one who caused the injury pays compensation for damage. And the Gemara notes, by inference, oh no, I'm sorry, I just read that. So the Gemara answers, an example of a case where one must pay compensation for pain alone is as that which the Mishna teaches explicitly. How is payment for pain assessed? If one burned another with a skewer or with a hot nail, or even if he burned him on his fingernail, which is a place where he causes pain but no bruise, not even a bruise, and certainly no damage. So there was no personal injury, there was only pain. So the court evaluates the monetary value of the pain. And so an example of a case where one must pay compensation for medical costs alone is where some body part was hurting, and another came and brought him a strong drug, and it whitened his flesh. And the law is that the second person must give him another drug to restore the color to his flesh, even though he caused no damage. There was no loss of function, but he was a cosmetic difference, and that's going to require further healing, and the one who caused this process is on the hook for it. So an example of a case where one must pay compensation for loss of livelihood alone is a case of one who locked another in a room and forced him to be idle, but did not cause him any personal injury. I mean, that's actually kidnapping, but you forced him to miss work, and so now you're going to have to compensate him for the loss of livelihood. And an example of a case where one must pay compensation for humiliation alone is a case of one who spit in the face of another without causing him any personal injury. There was only humiliation, And you are going to be liable for that cost. The Mishnah teaches how is payment for loss of livelihood assessed, and the court views the injured party as though he were a watchman of cucumbers. Now, here we have to, again, repeat. Let's say that you injured a person and it turned out that he was a concert violinist. Okay, and now he can never perform his job again. And this is a person who earned millions of dollars a year performing as a violinist. Now, when you calculate the loss of livelihood, it would seem that during the time that he's healing, well, during that period, like for the rest of his life, he's not going to be able to perform these concerts when he would have made a huge amount of money. So the loss of livelihood must be a huge amount of money. And the answer is the huge amount of money is calculated as the damage. The damage is that this person has had a loss of livelihood. When we talk about the damage category called loss of livelihood, we're talking about the time that he is idle while he is recovering from the wound. So even a person who lost his hand, they can no longer perform as a concert violinist, he could be working as a watchman of cucumbers, who's somebody who just walks around the field and makes sure that, I suppose, robbers don't come or animals don't come and steal the cucumbers. And you can do that even if you've lost a hand. So when we're talking about just that specific category, loss of livelihood, even a low-paying job that one could do even without his hand, that is how we would measure loss of livelihood. Loss of future earnings, shall we say, is what would be calculated within damage, the category called damage. And if you say, but the standard of justice was compromised, and the Gemara interjects to clarify this statement of the Baraisa, it appears to be compromised, as when this man will recover, he will not collect the wage of a watchman of cucumbers, but rather he will carry buckets and collect a higher wage, or he will travel as an agent and collect an even higher wage. The assessment of loss of livelihood should also account for these types of labor. But the Gemara moves on and returns to quoting the Baraisa. The standard of justice was not compromised because the one who caused him injury already gave him the value of his hand or the value of his leg. And that compensation took into account the professional opportunities he lost due to the injury, right? So that's why when we say damage includes loss of future earnings, loss of livelihood is just the fact that you were idle when you could have been doing something and weren't even doing that because you were in the process of healing. So Rava says, if one severed the hand of another, he gives him the value of his hand as compensation for damage, and for loss of livelihood, the court views the injured party as though he were a watchman of cucumbers. If one broke the leg of another, he gives him the value of his leg as compensation for damage, and for loss of livelihood, the court views the injured party as though he were a watchman at the opening to a courtyard, because he cannot work even as a watchman of cucumbers, as that requires walking around the cucumber field. But even one who has lost a leg can act as a watchman at the opening of a courtyard. And Rava continues, if one blinded the eye of another, he gives him the value of his eye as compensation for damage. And as for loss of livelihood, the court views the injured party as though the one who caused the injury caused him to grind with a mill, as even a blind person can do this. And that is what Samson did, right? When Samson was blinded in the biblical story, and they had him in prison, and the Philistines imprisoned him, they made him work. What work could the blind man do? Grinding a mill, right? And if one deafened another, he gives him his entire value as compensation for damage, because one lacking the ability to hear is not fit for any form of employment. Now, obviously, that's not true today. There's many things that people who are deaf can do, but in the ancient world, they had a less developed sense of that, and because they couldn't be sure that a deaf person had heard instructions, they say that he, would need to be compensated entirely. Now, Rava raises a dilemma. If one severed the hand of another, and the court did not yet evaluate him to determine the compensation, and then he broke his leg, and the court did not yet evaluate him for his additional injury, and then he blinded his eye, and the court did not yet evaluate him for this further injury, and ultimately he deafened him, then what is the law? Do we say, since the court did not evaluate him each time, one evaluation is sufficient for the court to determine his compensation, and the one who caused him injury must give him his entire value at once, as that is the compensation for having deafened him? Or perhaps we say we evaluate each injury one by one, and we obligate the one who caused him injury to give him compensation for each. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. Rav explains the dilemma. The difference is with regard to whether the one who caused the injury must give him monetary compensation for pain and humiliation for each and every one of the injuries. Although he does not give him monetary compensation for damage, medical costs, and loss of livelihood for each of the separate injuries, since ultimately he's giving him his entire value after deafening him, he is like someone who killed him, and therefore he gives him the entire value and no more. But in any event, must he give compensation for pain and humiliation for each and every one of the injuries, as the injured party had pain and humiliation each time? Right? It got worse and worse, so okay, you have to give him damage for his entire body as if he was fully paralyzed. But what about pain and humiliation separate for each of the injuries? And Rava continues, and if you say as a resolution to this dilemma that since the fact is that the court had not evaluated him after each injury, that the one who caused him injury pays him his entire value altogether, then there is another dilemma. If the court had evaluated him after each injury, but the one who caused the injury had not paid the compensation before he deafened him, then what is the law? Do we say, since it is so that the court evaluated him, the one who caused him injury is required to give him the compensation for each and every one of the injuries? Or perhaps, since the one who caused him injury had not yet paid these compensations before deafening him, he must give him his entire value all at once and not for all these separate payments. What is the answer? Teku. It shall stand unresolved. The Gemara does not resolve that question. I'm just going to go back and say something about the doctors. Where the question was, is the doctor obligated to heal? We know he's permitted to heal. You might have thought that God is the healer, doctors shouldn't get involved in the healing process. And the Gemara says, no, the doctor is absolutely given permission by the Torah to become part of the healing process and help the patient heal. Doctor is permitted. Is the doctor obligated? The Torah granted doctors permission to heal people. Working as a doctor is considered a mitzvah and is included in the obligation to save the life of one in danger. Even if another doctor is available, it is a mitzvah for a doctor to make an effort to heal another, right? To heal another. Now, it's not that we're going to perform every mitzvah that is in our power to perform, but it is considered an obligation for the doctor to heal if he has that chance to participate in saving the life. As we would hope, so it is. Okay, let's take a couple of questions. So is there a halakhic differentiation between one who accidentally causes injury versus one who intentionally did so? And we saw that with respect to the obligation to pay damage and those 4 types of indemnity, no, right? No, whether you did it unwittingly or intentionally, if you are the direct cause, you're going to be liable in those types of indemnity. Now, what was interesting is it seemed to say, even if you caused it due to circumstances beyond your control, that you are still liable, which was a little bit surprising. Yeah, this serves to include the category for those liable to pay compensation. It serves to include in that category of those liable to pay one who causes injury unwittingly, he didn't even know he did it, just like one who causes it intentionally, and one who causes injury due to circumstances beyond his control, just as one who causes injury willingly, right? And here it says, One who injures another, even unwittingly, and even due to circumstances beyond his control, is liable to pay compensation for the damage because a person is always considered forewarned, right? Like comparing to the ox, if the ox has a history of goring, the person's going to be on the hook, its owner will be on the hook for all the damage. If the ox has no history of goring, then it is an innocuous ox, right? There is no forewarning, and the owner is only liable for half the damage. But a person is compared to a forewarned ox, that we have our responsibility to make sure that we don't hurt other people. And even if we don't do it on purpose, and even if it happens due to circumstances beyond our control, we're still going to be on the hook. So big incentive there to do everything in our power to avoid hurting other people. Sharon, I was in a car accident in which my hand was broken and my car totaled. I had to prove how my injury impacted my work as a therapist, but also the impact on my being the primary caregiver for my quadriplegic husband. Did they consider non-income earning requirements as well? Oh, interesting, right? So not talking about your expenses, right? And the expense, not only the money that you spend healing your husband, but the time you put in at being a healer and caretaker for your husband. But you're saying also, right? Like not that you get compensated for your time, but that you need that time. Because you have your own obligations. Seems to me like that is going to be taken into account in the sense that, right, the time that you had that you no longer have wasn't just time, that you spent on leisure, but you use it to fulfill your obligations as a spouse, healing your spouse. I would think that would be taken into account. I mean, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it some more, but I would hope so. Please God, I would hope so that would be taken into account. And Joe, all of the and by the way, shkoyach, Sharon, shkoyach, shkoyach for the hard work that you do and have done and will do. All of the compensations are very close to workers' compensation judgments. With each body part, a claim is assessed. With each accident, the percentage is calculated and added on. I have firsthand knowledge. So there you go. I mean, when you think about that this was a system developed 2,000 years ago, I don't know if other court systems, sort of had the same kind of degree of meticulous sophistication when it came to assessing damages and doing the court's best to make people whole, to enable them to move on after traumatic injury. But it was a pretty sophisticated system, and maybe it was one of the most, or perhaps the most sophisticated system in the world. I mean, I don't know, but it seems like a pretty sophisticated system. So that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 86 here in